We need but tell our mind, our own self, with absolute certainty. This is how you return to peace if you've been disturbed. You tell yourself with absolute certainty. Yeah, you talk to yourself. Yes, not yeah. Yes, you talk to yourself. My wife would say, yeah, yes, you talk to yourself. The stillness of the peace of God is mine. That's what you tell yourself. You just remind yourself. The stillness of the peace of God is mine. That's a very great practice right there. The stillness of the peace of God is mine. And you return to peace. And nothing can intrude upon the peace that God himself, or God herself, or God itself has given to his creation, has given unto me. Let's say that again. If you are disturbed in any way, and you allow your peace to momentarily seeming to what? Be put to the side. It says, learn how to dismiss it and return to peace. And you do this by reminding your mind with certainty that the stillness and the peace of God is yours, and nothing can intrude upon the peace of God which has been given unto you. That is the practice. And so I'm going to read a couple scriptures out of Romans, and then I'm going to close. In the book of Romans in the New Testament, Romans chapter 8, verse 31. I think this is a good reference to help bring this practice home, this idea home, that the stillness of the peace of God is ours. And so Paul says here, speaking to the Romans, I think what Paul would first say to himself, when in Rome, don't do as the Romans do. Because they were very undisturbed. They were very disturbed people at the time. But verse 31 says, what shall we say then to these things? What things? You had to go to verse 30. He said, what shall we say to these things? And you had to go all the way back to verse 29. We had to go back to verse 28. These are the things that Paul was speaking to. So verse 28 says, and we know that all things work. See? And we know that all things work together in harmony, in integrity, in alignment. All things work together for good and for God. All things don't work together for bad. They all work together for good. The world will tell you that things work together for bad. This is bad. No, it's not bad. You're looking at appearances. There's good in everything. So he says, all things work together for good to them that love, or that love. Here it says love God, but that love in general. Because to love God is to love yourself and to love your neighbor. That's what love is. To love God is to love yourself, to love God, and to love your neighbor, all humanity. So if that's your mode of operation, if you have no exceptions in your life, if you walk in total equality with humanity, if you don't advocate for inequality, if you don't advocate for specialness in some special group, some special club, some special idea, and isolating other people, if that is not your way of operation, but you operate in the oneness of God, which is love, he says all things work together for good for those that operate in this manner, that does things in this way, that think in this way, walk in this way, live in this way, share in this way. All things are working together. He says, verse 29. He said, to them who are the called and have answered according to God's purpose, because all of us are the called. But the one that answers are the one that walks in love. It's not a religious group. It's not a political group. It's not a national group that is called. There's not a special group. God has no special group. There is no specialties in God. As much as we try to make it that way, as much as we try to make ours the only one, if we try to make ours the only way, as much as we try to make ours the top dog, as much as we try to compete with others and compete with all of that, is rubbish. And you can know it's rubbish in the results. But he says, for whom he did foreknow. For who did God foreknow? God foreknow what he created. He foreknow all of us. For whom he did foreknow, he also did predestinate. He didn't just predestinate a few. This whole idea, this insane idea that God destined some to greatness, destined some to eternity, and destined some to hell, or destined some to, failure. That's a cockamamie idea. And religion has promoted that for years, for centuries, that God has a special remnant, just a few, just one religion, just one idea, just one party. That this is the party of God. This is the football team of God. This is the basketball team of God. This is the artist of God. Like, we do all of this, and it is not love. It's our foolishness. Absolute foolishness. And look where it has gotten the world, in a mess. But we're straightening it up. For whom he did foreknow, he foreknew all of us because he created us. He also predestined us to be conformed to the image of what he created. God has predestined all of us to be conformed, like he said over in Romans, be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of the mind. And this is what we're doing. This is the practice that we've been doing for over a year now. To be conformed to the image of our oneness, of the one self that we share with God, that we might be the first among many. Jesus was the first among many. When you wake up to the reality of your true identity, you become the first among many. But eventually, God promised that all will eventually come to the knowledge of the truth. Oh, that's God, because that's the will of God. And the will of God shall prevail. So why shouldn't that be our will? It should be, because there's only the one will. Why should we want to destroy? Why should we want to see a people or a group or a nation or a race or a country fail? Why would we? Why would we even think that way? Because we don't know who we are. That's why. And we don't know who God is. But we're knowing now. Up until now we know. Now that we know. If you have been around Truly Foundation for 5 minutes, you know. And it says, moreover, whom he did predestine to be conformed to what he created, and that's all humanity. He said, them he called. So God has called all humanity. There are no exceptions. There are no exceptions. I don't care what the religious community is saying. There are no exceptions. I don't care what the politicians are saying. There are no exceptions. I don't care what the artists are saying. There's no exceptions. I don't care what spiritual paths are saying. If they're not saying that God has called all of us, then it's in error. And whom he called, which is all of us, he also justified. So all humanity is already justified. In him that he called, he also glorified. All humanity is already glorified. They don't need our 3-step process. They don't need our Roman road requirements. They don't need none of our religious requirements. They're already predestined. They're already justified and already glorified, every human being. Now, they may not know it, but they are. And they can't change that. And you can't change that. Your religion can't change that. All of the tradition of the world can't change that. Who shall bring one charge against the elect of God? Who do we think we are? To say it's got to be this way. And we got to do this, we got to do that. We got to pay this, and we got to pay that. No. That's the same thing the Pharisees and the Sadducees was doing back in the days gone by. And here we are in 2023, haven't learned a lesson yet. God has glorified, God has predestined and justified all of us. And when we align our thinking to that, most of our fears, most of our sickness, most of our pain and suffering will go away. Most of our lack will go away. Most of our heartache and broken relationships and messed up relationships will go away. When we embrace the atonement for ourselves, when we embrace the truth of the reality that all humanity are one, and that we want to break every label that we have established to separate ourselves, that we transcend the foolishness of this world that we have made out of ignorance. And so, what shall we then say to these things? Now, what shall we say to these things? That's what he was talking about. That's why I had to back up. So I'll let you know the things he was talking about. The fact that humanity, all of humanity, is to the praise of God's glory. Why? Because God has glorified us. God has honored us with the honor that comes from God only. Not the honor that comes from man, but the honor that comes from God only has been bestowed on every creation of God. And dare us say it's not so. Though we find ourselves fighting against the law of love. That's why you see so much pain and suffering and anguish in the world, because they're fighting against the truth. Unknowingly. Some do it knowingly, because they do it knowingly because they are prospering from others' ignorance. They are prospering from others' rejection of the knowledge. So what shall we say then to these things? If God be for us or for everyone, who can be against everyone? Who could stand up and say that someone is going to some hell or torture chamber? We need to stop that. God is love. He hasn't created a torture chamber for anyone to go to. Nor can any other creature create a torture chamber for someone to go to send what God created into the abyss. Where did we get that cockamamie idea? We got it from a mind that was steeped in sin consciousness, guilt, and fear. That's where it came from. And belief in separation. So if God be for everyone, who can be against anyone? He who spared not his own, but allowed his own to display the glory, to prove that death is not real. And that was Jesus' choice, not God's requirement. It was Jesus' choice to prove to us that death is not real. So you don't have to be afraid of it. He said, this same God has freely given unto us what? All things. Who shall lay anything to the charge of what God has elected and what God has created? It is God that justifieth and glorifieth and predestined. Who is he that condemneth? Who is he that judge? It said, it is the oneness that we share. That God has what? Shown and demonstrated his power, his resurrected power. And demonstrated this truth. And in verse 35, it says, who shall separate us from the love of Christ, from the love of oneness, from the love that we share? Who shall separate us from this love that we share, that is glorified, that is justified, that is predestined, that he foreknew because he created it? Who shall separate us from this peace that passes all understanding? He says, shall tribulations, shall the troubles of this life, he says, shall any distress, shall any persecution, or any famine, or any nakedness, or any peril, or any sword, shall any of these things separate us from the peace? Shall there be any distraction to come and interrupt us, that come and sever the peace and the tranquility and the calmness that God has given us? He said, is it possible that we can be severed from these things? And then Paul said in 37, no, he said, nay, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him, or through our true self, or through the love that we share. So it is through the love that we remain as God created us. It is through the love that we are glorified and what? Justified and predestined. So all of us have been predestined to experience your true self. All of you and all of us are predestined to maintain this peace undisturbed. It is possible to experience the undisturbed tranquility, like it says here, because God made it so. Love made it so, and it is so.